Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachigian, and today I'm joined by James Smith. This is normally the time when I would read my guest's biography, but James isn't the kind of person who identifies with a particular profession or field, and hence didn't have a biography on his website. I didn't bother to ask him because I can pretty much predict what the answer was going to be. He would probably say something like, that's not even the right question. So what I'll do instead is I'll read a blurb from his website, globalsportsconcepts.net, and this just describes a little bit about what it is that James does. Global Sports Concepts began in 2013 in order to serve as an educational resource for sport and military professions. The directive from the very beginning was to serve as a unifying agent for change given the Balkanized nature of specialty fields and the vast differential that exists between what is currently happening and what is possible in the education of coaches and military leadership, the people who hire/promote those individuals, and the people who hire/promote the people who hire/promote those individuals. I originally started this podcast because, like James, I wanted to espouse global thinking and just have some kind of a voice out there to counter a lot of the emphasis on specialization that we tend to see now. And nobody epitomizes that more than James. James is somebody who's influenced my way of thinking profoundly over the years, and he's also somebody that I've turned to help audit my own performance. You'll see that James tries to speak about sort of bridging the divide between what is knowable and what it is that's actually being done or executed in the world of sport, the military, and other professional endeavors like orchestral conductors, NASCAR pit crews. And the idea is that a lot of fields tend to regard the problems they're trying to solve as unique, and James, again, espouses that global way of thinking. And what he's suggesting is that, particularly in the world of sport, the problems that coaches and general managers are trying to resolve have sort of already been addressed by other professions, not necessarily solved completely, but the world of sport can turn to other professions to help at least answer some of the questions that they're struggling with. You'll notice that James is very objective in his analysis, and he tries to critique these complex issues in a way that's devoid of emotion, and that's something that I think we can all learn from in this day and age where people tend to get very emotionally attached to their beliefs, and a lot of times that's one of the biggest barriers to progress. So really hope you enjoy my conversation with James. I certainly know that I did.
Thanks so much for joining us. I know that we've been corresponding over the years, and it's great to finally do this. I wanted to begin by asking you a little bit about the impetus for writing your book, The Governing Dynamics of Coaching. So that book really speaks to some of the drawbacks of specialization and reductionism, and you make a case that in the world of sport, essentially, the distinction between something like a technical coach and a strength and conditioning coach are very arbitrary. In other words, so the technical coach should have the requisite knowledge in things like biomechanics and physiology, because essentially every technical or tactical drill is physical preparation, and conversely, the strength and conditioning coach presumably cannot adequately prepare an athlete for competition if he or she doesn't understand some of the technical and tactical aspects of the game. So I feel like you wouldn't have felt compelled to write this book if you hadn't witnessed or observed some dysfunction within the world of sport. So can you speak to sort of what motivated you to write the book in the first place?
First, Doug, thanks for having me on. And we've always had stimulating discussions in the past, so I expect nothing less from this one. And second, that was such an eloquent summary you provided. I think we can go ahead and just conclude the podcast.
Right.
To answer your question, I was fortunate to be self-educated in all things spanning the governing dynamics, and therefore having no biases presented to me from a mentor or a authority figure that played no part in my self-education. And so therefore, after what amounted to be maybe 3 years subsequent to me beginning my self-education and then beginning to both work in sport and have a knowledge as a result of reading things on the internet and in printed publication, having a knowledge of what was occurring in sport, this incongruency was a red flag that was so immediately apparent to me. And the only reason it was immediately apparent is because my self-education, fortunately, this did not consist of knowledge or forethought in terms of constructing my self-education. It just happened to be that I was fortunately reading fundamental information sources that did not present bias because they did not stem from factionalized either publications or constructs of what it means to become knowledgeable in some aspect of coaching, because all of that I was reviewing at the time was so much of what was coming out of Russian sport science in addition to the domains of international track and field. So what I was not reading and what I was not getting a sense of was this type of coach has these responsibilities and this type of coach has those responsibilities and this person does these things with therapy. None of that was conveyed, and anybody knows this who's read similar information. It's just simply the raw data of sensory motor skill and technical ability and biomotor output and dynamics and energetics, just the raw data. And fortunately for me, none of that was filtered through a bias, and that is my explanation for how quickly I realized what I criticize as being this colossal dysfunction in sport. So that was recognized from the very beginning, which in terms of my professional career in sport, which began in 2003, the book was just published at the end of 2016. So I was harboring this knowledge and this critical viewpoint for 13 years before the book was ever published. And anyone who knows me heard me talking about it or writing it here and there. But that's the reason for its germination.
Got it. And so you talked a little bit about your own self-education. So I think that segues nicely into what knowledge do you think is required to be a competent sports coach? So even if you have this global mindset, you obviously have to have some knowledge of the reductive parts, right? So what do you think are those parts as they apply to the world of sport?
Indeed. So those are characterized by what I have termed, borrowing from mathematics and physics, the term governing dynamics. Those are characterized by those as I described them in the book. And so I agree absolutely that because I'm actually a student of physics and mathematics, meaning every day I spend 2 to 3 hours as a student studying what is classical mechanics and calculus. And so I pull a lot from that. Again, it's self-study. I'm doing these things on my own. So these governing dynamics there is very much a reductionist part to it in terms of first principles, which I am very much a proponent of. I naturally think in first principles. How does it work? What are the fundamentals? What's the nature of this? However, as we all know, there are limitations to being only constrained to a reductionist standpoint, which is why there's a clear, valuable utility. And that is why a reductionist mindset is so prevalent in various scientific domains and technical domains. However, as you pointed out, that is not the end of it all in regards to the book. But if we focus on that for a moment, to define what is the knowledge that a competent coach must have, what I define as being the irrefutable answer to that is one in which that individual is an applied practitioner of every parent domain under which every subcomponent exists. And so I've defined those in the book to be culture, psychology, analytical, intellectual knowledge, technical, tactical, sensory, motor elements of advancement, of which, as you referenced earlier, are inseparable from their biodynamic, bioenergetic, and biomotor foundations, all of which is supported by the interventions in physiotherapy, passive and active modalities. So those are the governing dynamics, and any component that we would, or substrate that we would identify as being relevant is invariably related to one of those parent domains. So if we were to touch on some specific aspect of, say, neuroscience, or neuromechanics, or endocrinology, or molecular biology, or any realm of relevance as we begin to become more specialized will be a part of that construct in which the parent domain is psychology or sensory motor investigations or biodynamics or bioenergetics. What goes into establishing culture? What does culture even mean? Because that word is thrown around in sport, and I'm not convinced that the people who throw it around or put posters on the walls actually understand the definition of culture. So on and so forth. Those are the parent domains from which we can diverge. And to go on to answer your question, so what does that look like for a staff? Well, it's my conjecture that when sport just simply catches up to so many other professions around it, it'll begin with looking more similar to law school or medical school, a PhD system for any variety of scientists who, despite the types of specialization in law or in medicine or in science, what all those lawyers, regardless of specialty, doctors, regardless of specialty, scientists, regardless of specialty, and on and on and on, engineers, the list is long. What they all share in common is a fundamental education in their version of the governing dynamics. So regardless of what type of lawyer you speak to or what type of doctor or what type of scientist, they're going to be able to, specifically when you get those people together of different specialties, they have so much more in common than the existing specialists in sport who are not products of a more unified fundamental level of education. So that would be the beginning, certainly not the be-all, end-all, but that would at least be a start that would, in my estimation, have at least a few orders of magnitude improvement on the current dysfunctional conditions which permeate global sport and are only compensated for by the abundance of talent that shades what is missing. And that's what so many professionals outside of sport do not have the luxury of being compensated for by the compensating mechanisms of the medium of their trade craft. And that's something that coaches, amongst a few other people who deal with human beings, have the luxury of.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it speaks to something you write about in the book where the world of sport thinks that it's trying to answer unique questions. And a lot of professions do this where they think what they're doing is unique when, if you look at the examples you use, like an orchestral conductor or an executive chef or even somebody who's coordinating a NASCAR team, they're solving the exact same problems that sport is trying to solve, where they're utilizing this more integrated model. And you see the same thing in medicine where, in the world of rehabilitation, you have physical therapists and acupuncturists and chiropractors and even primary care physicians who are trying so hard to be unique and establish this professional and political identity, when ultimately, if they succeeded in that endeavor, the very thing that made them unique would also be less able to provide the service value to their patients because they only have one way of looking at a problem. But obviously, if you extrapolate that logic too far, and if everyone's a generalist and there are no boundaries, that probably isn't the ideal solution either. So if you're talking about the sport coaching model, if boundaries do need to exist between different positions, where do you think it's appropriate to draw those lines to avoid some of the redundancy that occurs when everybody is a generalist?
Well said. Well said. And the answer to that, I can simply point towards who has answered it and how. And that's why so much of what I bring to bear is in innovation and not invention, because it's simply the answers are all around us. So Neil Turok, who is a theoretical physicist and the director of the Perimeter Institute of Theoretical Physics in Waterloo, Canada, is an extraordinary individual who I've included his work in reference to his work, a big part in the write-up of the conclave on my website. He's of South African descent, and he grew up to long story short, he was a professor of mathematical physics at Cambridge, at Princeton, prior to going to the Perimeter. So he's a brilliant individual in the realm of theoretical physics. And what he has gone on to explain and in public domain is his criticisms of education for becoming too specialized. And he's done an extraordinary thing in creating the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences, which began in Cape Town, South Africa. And now I believe there's 9 of them across different countries in Africa, which I can touch on if you're interested. And so not only in this, the acronym is AIMS, AIMS, African Institute of Mathematical Science, not only there, but also at the Perimeter, administratively, groups are not recognized. So despite both the resident and visiting physicists who come to provide education to these young researchers, despite the whatever research tendency the physicist has, administratively, there is no groups recognized. So what does that mean? Fiscally, there is no recognition. There's no money allotted for this faction, for that faction. Everybody is coming from the same place and then only tending towards their fields of influence. I just the other day provided a description to this on the conclave, and I actually took a photo of it and posted it on the social media, in which I provide the analog to this. And what does it mean for the future? It means that regardless if you tend towards physical therapy or recovery, regeneration, or pain science, or cognitive advancement, psychological foundations, technical motion acquisition, sprint speed, biomotor foundations, any of the governing dynamics, as everyone is first and foremost educated as a generalist, you then naturally, based upon intrinsic aptitudes and interests, will tend towards your subject matter area of influence, and that is what you will tend to have a deeper understanding of than the other. So everyone is let's just use a word, coach. So everyone's a coach, and administratively, that's all that shows. On the staff directory, that's all that shows, just this group of coaches. And it turns out that between all of them, their specialty interests have allowed them to tend towards the educational pathways that suit them best to deepen their understanding. But first and foremost, they are unified by their understanding of the common principles. And the irony is that this was a standard in Western classical education that was lost. If we go back to the Middle Ages, and I mean, this is just, it was genius. And even if there's clear limitations viewed from a 21st century perspective, but even if the original version of the classical education was to exist commonplace today, again, I'll go back to using orders of magnitude, indicating just how much more productive the world would be, save, sport of the military. So what that classical education consisted of was the trivium and the quadrivium. Trivium 3, quadrivium 4. Trivium: grammar, logic, rhetoric. What is that? Grammar, the mechanics of language. Logic, the mechanics of thought and analysis. Rhetoric, the use of language to persuade. That would set foundation number one. The next level, the quadrivium. 4, arithmetic, number, geometry, number in space, music, specifically harmony, number in time, and astronomy, number in space and time. So the trivium sets up the foundations to progress to the quadrivium furthering that, which at the time, because we're going back to the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries and so on, philosophy and theology, that was the end game. And at that time, science was not its own domain. So philosophy encompassed the epistemology and the scientific domains within one. It was all considered philosophy and theology. So if we look at that trend alone, we see the genius in the lineage of what one leads to the next, and it's gone. It is absolutely gone. I actually had this conversation with someone who I was working with when I lived in England a few years ago, who was a professor explaining how these concepts of logic and reason and rhetoric have just disappeared from education. They've been lost over the ages. And I use that to circle back around. If the functional equivalent of that existed, we're using sport as an example, then we can see how through the sequential advancement of knowledge acquisition in the irrefutable, foundationally relevant domains of mathematics and science and art, et cetera, how those contribute so much more robustly to a qualified individual whose intrinsic tendencies and intellectual aptitudes and so on combine together to allow them to tend towards the more specific subject matter areas of interest that, to your point, solve the problem of redundancy that might otherwise emerge from only generalized knowledge.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I like how you said that in any kind of educational system, there needs to be some kind of a formalized structure and curriculum, as you see in medical school or law school. But once you have that requisite general knowledge, then just kind of allowing some sort of organic process to occur where people gravitate towards particular interests, how that solves the problem where you have a system that's both has some kind of structure but is also very adaptable and fluid. It kind of reminds me of, one of my frustrations in pararescue was that I'm like, man, we're training in so many different things. How can we be good at anything? But what would ultimately happen was certain people would gravitate towards, say, parachuting, and some guys towards diving, and some guys towards technical rescue. And then, we all had that general skill set, but then allowing people to gravitate towards specific interests made the team ultimately better because then those people who pursued their own interests would share what they learned with the rest of the team, and then even were able to build everybody's general abilities. So I think that's really neat. Now, if we're talking about education and knowledge, mentorship presumably needs to play some part in that. Now, I've seen in your book and even in some other podcasts, you've been critical of the apprenticeship model because ultimately you're saying, well, what if the mentor doesn't possess that requisite knowledge? In other words, who decides if the mentor is a legitimate source of information? Now, just for the sake of being abstract here, let's assume that the mentor does possess the relevant knowledge. That would kind of solve the problem that you see with the apprenticeship model. But I think a really interesting question, I spoke about this with Sidney Dekker a couple of episodes ago on the podcast. Sidney Dekker, if you don't know who he is, he kind of essentially has done the same sort of examination of the aviation industry and safety as you've done in the world of sports. So he's looked at major safety incidents in aviation, and one of his criticisms was that safety investigations tend to be very myopic and reductionist and look for very simple solutions to problems because those simple solutions are comforting and they make us feel like we've moved on and presumably have some kind of a concrete strategy to enact policy change. But a lot of times, there are overriding cultural things that may have contributed to even, let's say, a broken part on an airplane that needs to be replaced. Same thing he talks about in a hospital where you might have a nurse who administers the wrong dose of a medication that can prove to be fatal in a patient. And now it's very easy to blame that nurse and say, well, that nurse screwed up, gave the wrong dose of medication, when maybe the hospital, for financial reasons, has taken some shortcuts. And, it's kind of like that butterfly effect where even a very trivial thing in a complex system can lead to an adverse outcome where it's presumably one thing that's causing that very global type effect, but it's never that simple. So I guess long story short, my question is, and transcends any field, and I don't think any field has the answer, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective. Who decides ultimately what knowledge is good knowledge? And from there, who are the people that should be, sort of bedrocks for particular professions and passing on that knowledge to the less informed?
Indeed. Well stated. I'm enjoying hearing you explain your side of this very much. The answer, in my judgment, has already been provided, and it's been provided by the best of science, and more specifically, the culture behind scientific discovery, which exists within the domain of constant evolution. So nothing is absolute. And the best of scientific discovery, and for me, I would speak most towards physics because that's what I study and read the most about, is the way that the best of what I'm referring to embraces and cherishes the fact that you might be completely wrong tomorrow. And the way this works is through knowing what is knowable, and the difference between information knowledge and understanding knowledge, and the value. I've talked so much in the book and in podcasts about physicist David Deutsch, who's expounded upon this subject matter in terms of a good explanation is one that is hard to very well still explaining what it purports to explain. So at any given time, there is the forefront of what is known. And in this day of information technology, where it's never been easier to know what is known by way of knowing what questions to ask your computer search engine, the knowledge has never been more available. Yes, there is a filter required because along with the good comes the bad, and it's not just to say that any Google search or what have you is going to render the best of what is knowable. It might just render an equal partition of nonsense, and so that's up to each user to have the filtration system in place. And what is that? We come back to the value of a good explanation, and one could rationally simplify this idea of how to filter the world around you down to that level of discerning one person's explanation from the next. And so if the culture of any educational leadership in sport, if you want to call it a mentor or a teacher, whatever, if everyone is driven by no absolutes, staying on top of knowing what is knowable and mitigating the difference between what is knowable and what you know as it pertains to the subject matter in question, by adhering to these fundamental principles which the best of science has already shown the world, and anyone who works in science and certainly is an appreciator of it already knows what I'm talking about, is just par for the course. That simply needs to extend to what we're talking about here. And in this way, we know that the possibility of bias and resulting confirmation bias is mitigated, if not eliminated, because everyone is adhering to operating objectively and not myopically, not with bias and prejudice, as is unfortunately epidemic in sport, as well as many other industries, but we're talking about sport here. So the commitment to objectivity, knowing what is knowable, operating without bias, nothing is absolute. This might be completely wrong tomorrow. Conjecture, criticism, lying at the bedrock of new knowledge creation. Understanding that experience means zero. In the context of new knowledge. I'll repeat myself. Anyone's experience means zero in the context of the development of new knowledge. Absolutely zero. And that was the fallacy of empiricism, which unfortunately was useful and has woven itself into the very fabric of most modern societies. And for that reason is the dysfunctions, which I criticize, and individuals like yourself and me could talk about for hours, the symptoms of what began in the 17th, 18th century construct from the scientific authority, creating empiricism, which is where empirical evidence and experiential authority, all of these fallacies emerged from, still are very much alive and well and strongly negatively affect the possibilities of so many organizational hierarchies whose mode of operation is embedded in empirical ramifications. So how do we get away from those? By fostering criticism and understanding conjectures and criticism. That is how you evolve new knowledge that, in order to remain standing at the end, must pass the modes that we have of error correction and trial and experiment and how well it meets the predictions, etc. That is how new knowledge, and it is the only way. It is not through experience. The falsity of empiricism was that knowledge comes as a result of sense impression. So I see, I hear, I smell, I taste, I touch, and as a result, I'm more knowledgeable. False. And I've explained this before. There's a very big difference between relative and absolute new knowledge. So you can take anyone off the street who has no knowledge of military tactics and put them through some tactics that you use as a combat medic, and to them, they've learned something new. However, what you showed them is nothing new in the realm of combat medic tactics. So it was not absolute new knowledge. And so what happens is, if people who actually have convinced themselves that experience means anything in the context of new knowledge, what they've failed to realize is that if that was true, the human race never would have evolved past the Stone Age. Because when cavemen were banging rocks together, not one of them at some point would have progressed to the flint to make a spark. And beyond that, no one would have utilized, natural gases or otherwise to ignite to make a flame, and utilize electricity to create light and fire and the rest. That never would have happened, because if it was only observation, if it was only experience without criticism and conjecture, never, ever, ever would there have been that instance in which Doug said to James, I see the way you're doing it, but I think there's a better way. I suggest we try it this way, and here's why. That would never happen if it was just Doug watching what James does, and then enough time goes by. Now the whole world is doing what James is doing, but no one's doing it any better, and we fail to evolve. That's what happens in a strictly empiricist environment. Fortunately, that's not the case. However, the fact that the empiricist implications still exist is the reason why nearly any job application or interview is predicated upon how many years have you been doing this, and where have you been doing it, and what have you accomplished, almost none of which has anything to do with your knowledge as it applies to that profession. And therein lies the rub.
I love what you said about no absolutes, because in any complex system there are no absolutes. Certainly there are some answers that are better than others, but it really speaks to the need for humility and how we shouldn't be emotionally invested in the knowledge that we have, and the need for open-mindedness. And if we're talking about really good teachers, I've had one of my mentors in physical therapy, Bill Hartman, who I've also had on the podcast. I remember, when we would be evaluating patients, he would actually say to me, he would say, well, this is what I think. And he would say, Doug, what do you think? And it wasn't a rhetorical question. Some people do that rhetorically. he legitimately wanted to know if there was a better way of doing something. And I'm like, I'm here to learn from you. Like, what could I possibly contribute? But he was open-minded, and he did listen, even though he didn't necessarily need my input. I remember my first couple of missions as a PJ. I was up in Alaska doing some civil search and rescue alert, and we got alerted for what was supposed to be a jump mission. It ended up not happening because they found the survivors on the glacier there. But we were literally getting ready to jump. I'm so green. I'm like not even a year out of PJ school, and the team leader, jump master, who had 10 or 15 years more experience than me, was asking me like, "Hey, are we forgetting anything in this bundle? We've gone through our checklists. This is what I think we should be doing as far as the best way to stabilize the patient and utilize all the different medical assets. But am I missing something?" And again, not a rhetorical question, legitimately wondering if there was something that he was missing, and that even though I was less experienced, if I had knowledge that could contribute to a better outcome. So that humility seems very rare these days, because people, for whether it's an emotional reason, just need to be right all the time. And a lot of times the most knowledgeable people are the ones who embrace uncertainty and aren't afraid to obviously show that kind of intellectual vulnerability. So I want to transition that a little bit. We've been talking about knowledge. We talked a little bit offline about how even in cases where people are amendable to reason and logic, so you mentioned some situations where you were advising some sport coaches about how to more adequately prepare their athletes for competition, and you went down the list of the things that you thought would be beneficial, and the coaches said, that makes perfect sense, but for logistical or political reasons, we just can't implement them. So when we're working with human beings, a lot of times, even, we're in this information age where we can never have too much information or knowledge. And I would argue that we should always be pursuing more knowledge, but I also think that there's plenty of information now to make the world a better place than it is, but we're just not applying that knowledge because human beings are difficult, not always amendable to reason and logic. So if you take an example from nutrition, people get so myopic about, what are the macronutrient ratios and paleo diet versus Mediterranean diet. If you take all those different things, the principles tend to be the same. So ultimately, everybody knows for the most part that eating an apple is nutritionally superior to drinking a soda, but not everybody does that. So how do you think that we can bridge the gap between the knowledge that we have and implement it in a way that human beings are able to embrace those things more productively?
It in my judgment, always does come down to knowledge being the limiting factor. Hence, the first page of my book being a quote from David Deutsch: "The limiting factor is not resources, for they are plentiful, but knowledge, which is scarce." And what that means is, because this is all hypothetical anyway, if we accept for the sake of argument that a modern day functional equivalent of the trivium and quadrivium was to be the universal standard of education in every country on earth that is developed to the extent that it has formalized educational opportunities, that level of foundational knowledge that is no longer restricted to the privileged, but every human being, that alone, just to grapple with the eventualities of that, it is not difficult conversationally, I don't think, for any rational thinker to accept that I have a logical conjecture by saying, if that were the case, let us challenge the computational ability of our calculators by how many orders of magnitude just speaking ambiguously, how much better the world would be, and humans would treat each other, and the world in which we live, in the atmosphere, and all the rest. It does, without question, come down to a limited knowledge, because Doug, the flip side, the way that I proof this is by saying, show me the instance in which the problem exists independently of the knowledge of the people or people involved in being unable to solve it. You will not be able to conjure a situation in which, actually it had nothing to do with a limited knowledge. It had to do with fill in the blank. It cannot exist, because when you thoroughly analyze any given situation, the only limiting factor can possibly be knowledge as to some hypothetical problem that exists to someone otherwise unable to see the grander picture, who might think that it's something independently of the knowledge. It's always, always knowledge. And at the most foundational levels, as David Deutsch has put so eloquently, any physical transformation of which is governed by the laws of physics that is not achievable. For instance, why do our airplanes not fly at close to the speed of light? Why not? That would be so much. Imagine how that would economize the efficiency of travel. Why is that? We know that they cannot go at the speed of light, but what if they approach it? Well, what physics says is, well, that's possible. There's no law of physics that contradicts traveling somewhere along that path close to the speed of light, that by comparison to what our current aircraft is capable of traveling is just, it's a colossal difference in velocity. So physics does not constrain the possibility. So what does then? Knowledge. And if someday knowledge evolves to the point where we could solve that problem, yet it remains unsolvable, then what's possible is we will discover a law of physics that we were not aware of previously, and that explains the constraint. Either way, it is always a limiting case of knowledge, always. And this applies to every conceivable situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose that even if we're talking about something like behavioral modification, where depending on how you frame the language, you could say, well, the knowledge is there, but it's getting the person to implement that knowledge. I suppose that even the field of behavioral modification is contingent upon requisite knowledge. And if you're unable to elicit that behavioral modification, perhaps your knowledge of that field was the limiting factor in, I guess, getting that individual to embrace whatever nutritional knowledge or physical preparation knowledge it is you're trying to instill. I think it also kind of speaks to how important it is for the people who possess this knowledge. Like, the burden is on those people to make their case in a way that is devoid of emotion. Sometimes when I feel like getting my blood pressure up, I'll go on some physical therapy social media threads just to witness the cannibalism that takes place there. And often what I'll see is the people who are more informed and better read and have a better grasp of the research will belittle people who don't have as firm a grasp. And it's like, if you're presuming that your knowledge is superior, then you shouldn't have to resort to these type of emotional tactics to get somebody to embrace your way of thinking. The knowledge should be self-evident. And so again, those people, even if they perceive themselves to be intellectually superior than those that they're belittling, in effect they're really not, because they can't make a case for that knowledge without resorting to some of these emotionally cannibalistic tactics. So I mean, sometimes it gets into semantics, I guess, but I think that from like a leadership standpoint, we need to, if you think that your knowledge is sufficient and something that can better or produce better outcomes, that burden is on you, as opposed to blaming people who don't accept your way of thinking. And how can you continue to make a better case versus saying, look, like I've said all these rational things and people don't want to embrace it, and then evade responsibility for making a better case, which I think often occurs when people make a cursory attempt to illuminate something intellectually, and then they just get frustrated and then resort to name calling, which we see all too much in social media. I want to jump around a little bit because we're talking about anti-specialization, so that we're not going to be too coherent with some of the themes here. But you've spoken a lot about emotional control in sport, and I love your take on it, because you've pointed out that there's a double standard between what athletes and coaches are expected to do. So in other words, if we see a coach having a tantrum on the sideline, yelling at an official, throwing a chair, coaches tend to have more leeway with officials as far as getting a technical foul or unsportsmanlike penalty conduct. But if a player does the same thing, even if the player isn't penalized by an official, that player is often berated by the sport coach. So can you speak a little bit about that double standard and how it can be toxic to creating the kind of culture that you espouse, and how that segues into some of the drawbacks of authoritative leadership, which is something that you've also been very outspoken against?
Yes, indeed. Well stated again. And the enormity of this particular case is not something to be overlooked. Here's what I would encourage listeners to consider. And actually, as someone who often works in isolation and I'm an only child, this is also a way that to this day, at 43 years old, I'm still a master of amusing myself with these types of thought experiments. So follow me here. Note both the motor function, the behavior, the audible indicators of early childhood, and the striking similarities to two different cases in adulthood, one of which is the level of inebriation, and the other is the loss of emotional management. So what am I talking about specifically? What's something that an infant does on a regular basis that also either an inebriated adult or an adult with no control of their emotions also demonstrates? And this is from my own comedic entertainment. Maybe someone else will laugh along with us. So how often does an infant soil him or herself? And how do we correlate that to what level of intoxication does an adult similarly soil himself?
Okay.
How often does an infant scream void of the cognitive and intellectual advancement associated with language acquisition and the ability to communicate more streamlined? So they scream instead. How often does an inebriated adult scream? How often does an adult in a heightened state of emotion scream and yell? And for the same, let me rephrase, for in part the same exact reason, that their absence of perspective, their absence of focus, their absence of objectivity, logic, and reasonable thinking has separated them from, let's say, otherwise a vocabulary that they operate with under more focused conditions, and now the words don't come to them. So what do they use? Profanity, yelling and screaming, demeaning. It's the same exact thing that the young child is doing, only in the child's case, they just don't have the vocabulary, let's say. So we go down the list and we see so much, the near totality of bad behavior from an adult is a direct analog to what almost any child does at some point along the way of biological development. So what do we have to learn from that? And what do we do with that information? Well, what we see is, so in this emotional context, so we're excluding intoxication or any other drug from the discussion, and now it's just simply what type of psychobehavioral set of skills are you working with. What we see is any of this unproductive escalation in emotion that leads to bad communication, bad treatment of others, bad behavior. There is no way to justify it as having some utility. It is only a negative. Now what I'll say next is clearly something very controversial. I look forward, hopefully in my lifetime, to artificial intelligence emerging to the extent where abstract reasoning skills and general knowledge is demonstrated by this synthetic being, void of the emotional component that it is so inefficient for the human condition in the contexts, this is my caveat, in the contexts of every single decision that would be characterized as important because emotion is the absence of rational thought. And that is why it can feel so good and feel so bad and everything in between. However, it is never a useful condition in which to make an important decision. So it doesn't matter whether that's an officiating decision by an official in sport, a coaching decision by a coach, or the execution of a sport maneuver by an athlete. There is no condition in which a heightened emotional state presents an advantage. There is none. And what one realizes is even those coaches or athletes who have very poor emotional control and are in one way or another throwing a tantrum every competition when things don't go their way, regardless of what their acumen, their knowledge may otherwise consist of, what you can see is in the moment of decision making, they're not emotional. I like to use in American football, I'd use the example of the great former Ray Lewis of the Baltimore Ravens, would be a Hall of Famer, all the rest, one of the great linebackers of the game. Clearly a very emotional individual, the way he would get riled up and rile his defense up before the games and between plays. But observe his play when the ball is snapped. Specifically, at the moment of reading motion of backfield guards, the moments preceding a tackle, what don't we see? What we do not see is the same level of hurrah, hurrah that might exist in the moments external to the most important decision making, similar to coaching, officiating, anything else. So what these individuals who are proponents of, perform with emotion, play with emotion, what they're failing to realize is if anyone actually does that and fails to focus at the time of action, they're now inhibited. They're now inhibited unequivocally by what you're encouraging them to do. So it in effect, without this knowledge, is an instruction on how to detract from your performance. And this goes for any conceivable situation that demands clear thinking, in or out of sport, whether it's romantic relationships, something happening at work, or whether it's on the track or the field or the ice, on the battlefield. No one can conjure up a situation in which it is to your benefit to be as in a heightened emotional state. Doesn't matter what that is, anger, levity, joy, none of it. None of it is useful because all of it detracts from your ability to make the split-second decisions that are based upon what has been automated through effective preparation. They're negatively impacted. So this is vital to understand, yet clearly is misunderstood, and that is the reason why we see so many coaches and so many athletes in a variety of different types of sports and military who do not have effective management of their emotions, and the evidence for that is the tantrums that we see demonstrated on any given day watching some, for example, sport competition.
Yeah, I love your example of Ray Lewis and the distinction you make between the speech that he might give before a game and then when he's at the line of scrimmage reading the offense and he goes into execution mode. I don't know if you've read the book Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. It's very popular in the military, but it's kind of tells the story of the Battle of Thermopylae. It's more of a written version. Yeah, and there's a part in it where Pressfield, the author, talks about what he calls pseudo-andria or false courage, which is the general giving that riveting speech before the battle, trying to get everyone in an emotional frenzy. And he contrasted that with the Spartans, who he said regarded every enemy as nameless and faceless and didn't need to personalize the enemy because they're solely preoccupied with execution and their whatever systematic process they had is tactically. So the playing with passion and emotion thing is a very popular narrative in sport that I think you've deconstructed very well. Now, another narrative, because the idea is, again, that, we say play with emotion, play with more passion. I don't think coaches actually know what it is that they're actually advocating. So there's probably, like any physiological parameter, an optimal level of emotional arousal that enhances performance. But like any other physiological parameter, if you take it to the extreme and you say more emotion, more passion, those are the guys who tend to have trouble executing and are maybe jumping off the line of scrimmage or running the wrong route because they're too worried about, what the defensive back said to them the play before. Now, another very popular narrative in sport is the mental toughness one. You've called mental toughness the Easter Bunny. So can you elaborate on why mental toughness is the Easter Bunny?
Indeed. I'll first state one of my close friends in special operations gave me the Gates of Fire many years ago, and throughout the Governing Dynamics book, I have quotes from Pressfield, including the pseudo Andreas. That's filtered through the book, so that's very useful information for all. Actually, not just sport. Anyone who deals in conditions of volatility and pressure would do well to learn more about how the Spartans operated in wartime. As to the falsity of mental toughness, first off, is I would encourage people not to take complete confidence even in a dictionary definition, because what people may not realize is that the only criteria for words making their way into a dictionary is that enough of the population uses that word. So let us not associate a synonym of validity, of meaning, simply because it's in the dictionary. Because what you'll find, for instance, if you look at toughness as a dictionary reference, you will find the strong enough to withstand, certain conditions, and the ability to, deal with hardship and cope in difficult situations. And what I would point people's attention towards is the actual description, because the misnomer comes in utilizing the bad language of mental toughness or toughness and assuming that you understand what it actually means. Earlier, I made the criticism that the word culture is thrown around, and I'm not convinced that everyone who uses the word actually knows the definition. Similarly, when I consult with coaches, because a common request is, I just had a meeting with a receivers coach for in American football that was telling me how the head coach is really looking to see what he can do about making the team tougher. I mean, this is very common. Many different. I'm doing some consulting with one of the top rugby programs in the world, and it's sort of built around that question as well. So everyone is familiar with this in sport, but what they're not familiar with is they're not asking the right question. So even if we just look at the definition of toughness, and again, I'm first offering the knowledge that any word can make it in the dictionary if enough of the population uses it. So let's not put full stock in the fact that a word exists in the dictionary. Let's look at what the description is, however. The ability to deal with hardship or to cope in difficult situations. The state of being strong enough to withstand adverse conditions or rough handling. This is just, anybody can Google toughness and that pops up. In the behavioral context, because obviously it means something different in the cases of metallurgy and different engineering, composites, and so on. So even in this vernacular of behavior, the difference between, James, my guys aren't tough enough, what can I do? The difference between that question and that individual having the knowledge to understand, again, it comes back to knowledge, what is the actual limiting factor? And in that, we understand that, so the limiting factor is not a lack of toughness, because just these couple definitions of dealing with hardship and coping, they extend to a much broader set of psychobehavioral attributes that are also glossed over. When we start talking about tenacity and aggression and resolve and resiliency and self-regulation, emotional control and team cohesion, all of these together get lumped. Because whenever I've asked a coach, I said, I'm disallowing you from using the word tough. You can't use that. I want you to think about the question you're asking me. I want you to provide contextual literacy. So give me a specific example of a limiting factor, either through action, through behavior. I want you to understand your job better. So I want you to think about this situation and now ask me a more comprehensive question. And, listeners might be amazed at how many times all sorts of coaches that I've posed this question to have said, they've kind of chuckled and said, oh man, I never thought of it that way. Hold on, I have to think about that. And of course, my reaction is, are you kidding me? You have to think about that? I mean, this inside, I'm thinking, this is amazing. How could someone be fit for this work where you need to take a moment to actually think about the question you're asking me? That's really disappointing. Now, that aside, this comes back to the first principles, the nature, how's it work? So if I notice in sport and a limiting factor, mustn't I understand the nature of that limiting factor before I seek to gloss over it with some ambiguous terminology that in this case, I do consider it to be the Easter Bunny? That, mustn't that individual have the requisite understanding to first off ask the right question? It all comes back to that, because this is a very comprehensive undertaking to have a requisite understanding of these governing dynamics, which is why we distinguish between an applied practitioner and someone who's actually a PhD in any given discipline. Of course, the coach could not be expected to have the PhD level understanding of every single part of the governing dynamics. However, what they can have is a practical understanding, and which thereby allows them to assimilate the information into practice and have an effective dialogue. So this is I'm going to come back to something in a moment, but this is something as an example that I do just in life, because I've had way too many disappointing encounters with psychologists and medical doctors and specialists in this and specialists in that, where I walked out of the consult thinking, this person is unfit for their job. And that has then compelled me to self-educate, which is why if I'm going to consult with a medical doctor or a neuromechanist or an engineer, it happens. I have personal passions in physics, engineering, and mathematics, so I'm constantly doing those on my own. But otherwise, I know that I need to self-educate, because I simply do not trust the system, because I've been disappointed way too many times and unimpressed, which is why degrees and advanced, letters and this or that mean absolutely zero to me, because in actuality, all they signify is the minimum possible standard that someone needed to fulfill in order to achieve the accreditation. Going back to the issue of the toughness and the implications, you're well familiar with me utilizing references and special operations to prove that example. So yourself. If I say, Doug, I want you to tell everybody your mindset as you are, when you're supporting one of these tier 1 units and you have full oxygen and you jump out of the plane at 33,000 feet for a high altitude, high opening, whether it's training or operational, I want you to talk about your mindset. Now, I'm going to speak for you now, Doug, because I know the answer, because of my friends and I've been working with these guys for so long. What every one of you is going to answer is, I'm focused. I have a checklist that I go through in my head. I'm checking the integrity of my rig, my oxygen, is it on? I got my navigation on my wrist, the operational plan, the tactics, etc. Focus, objectivity. Similarly, I like to use, mixed martial arts. So it's easy. So are these, whether you're a combat medic or a shooter, does anyone dispute, if I just throw it out there to the general public, special operations, tough or not tough? You tell me. Of course, tough. Combat, bullets flying, life and death, jumping out of planes, yes, tough. Easy. Okay. What about an ultimate fighter? Inside the cage, 3-ounce gloves. You either get submitted, knocked out, or defeated on points. You're fighting. Tough? Not tough? Okay, yeah, tough. Yeah, tough. Of course, you're in there, you're fighting. All right. Now what do we know? What do we know about the absence of what is colloquially understood as toughness? What's the absence of that? Well, the absence of that, what's the absence of the ability to deal with hardship, the ability to cope, the absence of the ability to withstand adverse conditions? What's the opposite of that? I'll tell you what the opposite is. It's anxiety. It's a stress reaction. It's perspiration. It's heightened blood pressure and heart rate, an elevated galvanic skin response. All of these are the absence of that focus that Doug or any special operations individual will describe that they have, similarly to any ultimate fighter walking into the cage. So we agree that, special operations, yeah, of course you have to be. Ultimate fighting, yeah, absolutely you have to be. And we also recognize if you're not, I'll just use the word to prove the example. If you're not tough, what are you? You're having a panic attack. You're having an anxiety attack. That's not tough. Okay, then. We agree. We agree that we can measure physiologically. We can measure heart rate, respiration, galvanic skin response, blood pressure, perspiration. All of these we can objectively measure in non-subjective quantities. Yes, no one refutes that. Okay, so now what happens when I surprise Doug by throwing him into the octagon, and I surprise the fighter by throwing them into the plane with the oxygen in the middle of the night with a parachute? And let's say, for sake of example, Doug has no MMA training and the ultimate fighter has no special operations training. Guaranteed, both Doug and the fighter, when put in each other's shoes, are going to exhibit some type of a stress response. Now, am I saying that Doug's going to have a panic attack? No. However, with these objective quantities, I guarantee that the difference in the objective quantification of heart rate, blood pressure, galvanic skin response, perspiration, respiration, etc., is going to be elevated in both the special operator and the fighter to a degree unseen in their typical environment. So what happened? We just said, okay, I agree. You're not tough if you're having a panic attack. Well, what I just proved is nobody's tough. You're trained or you're untrained. Because if Doug or any other special operations person also has a steep interest in mixed martial arts combatives training, and if every ultimate fighter out there on the side is doing high altitude jumps and going to the gun range and doing all these things, then a level of training exists in that domain. And now, even though that's not what that individual does full time, we can throw that special labor. I think of Tim Kennedy, the Green Beret who had a long UFC career that just returned back to special forces. So there's an individual who's an ultimate fighter and a special operator. So anyone who has the training will similarly demonstrate a focused level, an absence of elevated heart rate, blood pressure, galvanic skin. They're focused. They're not having a panic attack. They're not having an anxiety attack. So It's training. It's specific training for specific conditions, and therefore you habituate yourself, you inoculate yourself for those conditions. Now, is it conceivable for someone to demonstrate a level of focus in a wide spectrum of endeavors, going a wide spectrum of high volatility? So let's not make it easy. High volatility. So what are conditions of high volatility? Unpredictability, chaos, pressure. Well, we've already talked about special operations. We've already talked about ultimate fighting. What else? Emergency, as I use examples, emergency room, trauma room surgeon, a director in, Homeland Security, CIA, tactical divisions, a Wall Street hedge fund CEO. So very different manifestations of volatility, pressure, anxiety. Notice I did not use the word stress, because that's another Easter bunny, which we can talk about if you like. Pressure, volatility, a lack of predictability. What do they share in common? What do the most acute operators, I use that word ambiguously now, operators in stocks and bonds, operators in terms of the emergency room, etc. What do they share in common? Coolness under pressure. Focus. Focus is the word. They're focused. They're not panicked. They're not having an adverse reaction. They are not suffering from a lack of motor control. They're not suffering from an inability to communicate concisely and effectively in the moment of high pressure. None of that. Just the opposite. What are they able to do? Focus, actualize the physical skills of their trade craft with precision, communicate concisely and clearly, thereby instilling a sense of focus in those around them to do the same thing. So we look at these commonly shared factors, and could we say, or rather, how would we answer the question? What would it be about someone who could go from the C-130 at 33,000 feet in the middle of the night to the cage, to the emergency room, to the hedge fund office, and on and on and on down the list? What could allow them to go in every conceivable environment and demonstrate focus? Well, the answer is training, habituation, preparation, inoculation. Choose your favorite colloquialism. You must prepare for that set of conditions. And that preparation consists of both the pure sort of theoretical and academic, visualization and psychological things that are non-physically demanding, in addition to those that require the motor skill operation to negotiate, the weapon and the surgical instruments and so on and so forth, the mediums of tradecraft, training, or whatever your preferred colloquialism is. So back to the original question then, what's the limiting factor? Do not talk to me about toughness. That's off the table. What's actually the limiting? Is it that they're not aggressive enough? Is it that they are too negatively affected by setbacks? In that case, it has nothing to do with their aggressiveness. It's that they're lacking in resolve. What else is it? Are they having a difficulty in dealing with adversity? Are they having a limiting case of working well with a teammate? So, what is it? Is it a shortcoming in their ability to manage their emotions in a given contextual situation? There's a battery of these questions, and what happens is, if there is some level of, because we've already acknowledged, if someone asks me how do I get my players' toughness, immediately there is a knowledge deficiency. Now the question is just how deficient are they in knowledge? Because if I start asking those battery of questions that really begin to hone in specifically on the psychobehavioral attribute, that still requires a level of knowledge for someone to either say, you know what, it is more aggressiveness than it is resolve. That's true, it is. Okay, let's talk about aggressiveness. Alternatively, if there's not even that level of knowledge, then it's just a series of, I don't know. Explain to me, what's the difference between relentlessness and tenacity? What's the difference? what's the difference between resolve and self-regulation? Knowledge. So Doug, again, it's always knowledge. Knowledge is always the limiting factor. And in the case of the science fiction of mental toughness, I believe I've explained myself well enough to show that it does not exist. What does exist is training, specific training to allow any individual in any given context to be focused.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to emphasize the importance of context because, like you said, if I was to go through another military type selection course with a bunch of defensive linemen from a football team, I could say with pretty decent confidence that I'd be better at crawling through mud and running around the beach for 10 hours than somebody who weighs 100 pounds more than me. But if you were to put me on the football field and say, okay, you're the running back and you have to face said defensive line, I think my stress response would be a lot higher than it would be objectively than it would be if I were to have to do a free fall jump or even a real world type mission because I'm prepared for one and not prepared for the other. And you're seeing a lot of even sport coaches using that type of military, what's done or practiced in a military selection course under the guise of making their athletes mentally tougher. And I think you've pretty much shot down that notion. But I think an interesting question is, even for people who are trying to prepare for these military special operations type jobs, do you think that there's a better way to select candidates than what's traditionally being done? So I'm not talking about a higher level specialized unit where you're already pulling from special operations forces, but just typical recruit off the street. You're trying to turn them into a Navy SEAL, Army Ranger, Green Beret, pararescueman, combat controller, and you know that, or you're trying to devise a course where 80% of the people aren't going to make it because these types of courses are meant to be selection. It's not training. I don't think people recognize that distinction enough. You're trying to select the right people. So if you were to have to be in charge of selecting the right people in a logistically non-intensive, non-resource intensive environment, what do you think is a superior way of doing it as opposed to doing arbitrary numbers of push-ups and runs on a beach and crawling around? Or do you think that what's being done is good enough considering the constraints that these military units have?
Great question. And the finality of your question there, my answer is absolutely not in terms of is it good enough given the logistical constraints. I actually gave a lecture on this regarding military tactical preparation where I touch on some of it. So let's go to the irrefutables. And we talked about this earlier, that ironically, the absolute apex of special operation tactical ability has almost zero to do with physical potential, physical ability. Ironically, as you well know, as you're a product of, and myself too, though I failed twice, the near entirety of military selection, as you necessarily made the distinction between once you're already an operator versus someone coming out of basic training or boot camp, the near totality of selection is involved in, as you indicated, activities that do not require much resource, calisthenics, running, swimming, that you can have people do to exhaustion and therefore create easily quantified pass-fail situations to weed out. The problem is the lack of correlation between the basis on which you're selecting and what actually constitutes operational competence. It's actually astonishing. So what I could easily say is the current model of selection in the near totality of military special operations is about as relevant as if any sport out there was to utilize the same model for their method of talent identification and selection, which is to state, whether it's rugby league or field hockey or track and field or American football or world football, if we were to say, you know what, let's just see how fast everyone can run 3 miles, and we'll test them over the 6-week training camp. We'll test them every week. We'll really beat the hell out of them all day long with calisthenics and the rest, so that they're never actually recovered. And then we'll keep testing them in long swims and runs and how much pull-ups you can do and push-ups and et cetera, et cetera. Now, it does not take a individual with deep knowledge of any given sport to say, wait a minute, what does all this have to do with the sport? I'm watching these guys on the pitch, I'm watching them on the track. I just don't see the correlation of what this distance running has to do, or what this endless amount of calisthenics. I'm looking at what they do in terms of their sport maneuvers, and I just don't see a relationship. Similarly, and ironically, as you know well, Doug, there actually is steep physical requirements for any of these sports. Fitness in the forms of different types of running and opponents, overcoming opponents and evading opponents and throwing implements and jumping and all. There's all these physical requirements where there is not in the actual operational context of the military. So many people would be shocked to know that with the requisite psychobehavioral knowledge, tactical knowledge, that they could almost come off of the couch and keep up with a unit, for instance, in an urban environment, including the transit in, because you're walking with, maybe you're walking with a 30, 40, 50 kilo pack, but you're walking. So it's only the exceptions when we talk about, for instance, a special operations unit with a long transit, say in a mountainous region with a heavy pack or those certain under canopy conditions. There's very few exceptions in when it is a unique physical rigor. But on the whole, the physical rigors associated with the actual operational sense, insertion and extraction methods, negotiating yourself in a urban environment, in a jungle environment, in a wilderness, in a mountainous, minimal physical rigors, particularly in comparison to those associated with almost, of course there's exceptions, almost any sport. If we were to look at the running velocities of the middle and long distance runners in track and field, none of that is even touched in a special operations context. Because as you know from your own personal experience, and everybody who's both my friends and people I've consulted for at the tier 1 level, no one has ran more than on the whole 25 to 50 meters ever. So then what we say is, we know that we need to select individuals who have a strong level of fortitude psychologically and resolve and resilience to adversity, all these things that we're not going to gloss over with mental toughness. That's who we're looking for. But the fallible nature in which we're deciding who they are is via means of selection that have nothing, absolutely nothing, in most cases, yes, there's a couple exceptions, but in most cases, absolutely nothing with the job itself. So my answer to that as to what could be done differently given the same set of resources is simply steeped in knowledge, not a lack of resources. Just as the quote of David Deutsch, the limiting factor is not resources, it is knowledge. So what knowledge am I talking about? A more specific examination of what is it that distinguishes the most astute special operators from their lesser skilled brethren. And invariably, what we are honing in on are psychological characteristics molded with sensory motor ones, not gross physical outputs. Because when I look very closely at the decision making prior to and exiting an aircraft, for example, with a high altitude jump, the decision making under canopy, the decision making clearing an urban structure, clearing rooms, multiple levels, in a choreographed orientation of a assault squad. If I look at all of the actual tactical realities, insertion through different types of geographical regions and operations once you're on target. If I look at all of them and I state, this is what we are going to look at, this is what we are going to diagnose very specifically in order to demonstrate what it is actually that constitutes superior operational abilities. And what everyone's going to, same thing if I do it for any sport, what people will be amused to see is the near totality of preparation. I'll go back to sport now, because this is where one of the distinguishing characteristics that special operations has on the whole compared to sport is there's a much more efficient level of tactical preparation than there is in sport if we look at the analogs of each. So I'll go back to sport now and I'll say how amused the public might be, given the explanation I've just given, how much nonsense constitutes sport preparation. So if we shift back again, because your question was how would I change the military special operations, the answer is that the selection would invariably approach more closely the type of sensible training that already constitutes operator preparation. Because you already know, you've been through different, I'm not sure the terminology in the PJs, but the equivalent of the ruts and the different types of tactical excursions. If you're going through kill houses and otherwise, and you're being evaluated on your decision-making efficiency and operations and subduing, whether it's combatants, obviously in your case, dealing with people who've been injured, etc. We understand that there is a much greater level of thought and manifestation of tactical training. Not without its problems, because of course we can improve upon the organization of how anything is conducted. But if we look at the correlation between, for instance, kill house maneuvers and tactics of an assault squadron, the difference between what they do in training in a kill house versus what actually happens operationally, minimal. And so much thought goes into recreating structures and contingencies, B, C, D, E, and F. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if this guy goes down? What if the helicopter crashes? Really well thought out. Again, not beyond criticism, because of course we can go from one derivative to the next and point out all the things that are flawed. However, on that point alone, if we simply take, whether it's that kill house example I gave or any other number of medical rescue scenarios that you've been involved with in terms of preparatory exercises on a battlefield, dealing with people who have been shot, etc., how to deal with that situation based upon topographical differences in geography and climate, etc. And then what we say is, lo and behold, guess what selection should consist of? A greater degree of infusion of those types of, so what does selection necessarily include? It does include some training. We needed to train you a little bit to see how well you make decisions and how well you move given these tactical situations that if successful, this is what you'll be doing. This is your job. Your job won't be swimming 5 miles. Your job won't be running 6 miles as fast as you can with Bates lights and shorts. Your job won't be get on target and perform as many pull-ups as you can with your H gear. That's not your job. What your job is, decision making, moving efficiently, communicating efficiently under high pressure and volatility. What's the physical demands? Okay, yes, we have to see how well do you go through an obstacle course with your pack on and your gear on. Yeah, that's relative, but let's make sure we construct the obstacle course to be commensurate with the environment that we're preparing to go operational in. So the urban obstacle course is clearly different from the jungle and from the mountainous, etc. So what we're doing is we're necessarily integrating into selection a much greater volume of the types of preparation that is more specific, that actually correlates. That's the answer. Will it require more work in the form of thought energy and logistical arrangement? Yes, but nothing that requires any significant amount more of resources.
Yeah.
Other than
Sorry, go ahead.
Other than the intellectual ones.
Yeah, and that's why, often you hear, I think people have good intentions when they say we need to look at special operations personnel as elite athletes, and a lot of times the reason for that is so that these military members have access to certain programs that say, for example, the medical care that a special operator gets should be commensurate with what a professional athlete gets. But it's also asking the wrong question, because having worked with, I don't even know what constitutes elite, but I've worked with very high level athletes in my civilian job. And I mean, when you see what a truly elite, the physical gifts that a truly elite athlete actually has, I worked with very few, if any, of those people while I was in the military. Indeed. I was able to qualify for one of those special operations jobs, and I don't even remotely possess the athletic talent that it takes to play in the NBA or the NFL or even Division I in some of those sports. So to regard those types of people as elite athletes is fundamentally asking the wrong question. And on the surface seems innocuous, but if you extrapolate that too far, you can end up going down a rabbit hole where you're actually detracting from readiness, because you're focusing, like you said, too much on some of those physiological parameters. Now,
that's a very important point you just raised, and the fact that it exists, the fact that unfortunately, as this field of human performance going back 6-7 years and manifested itself in the military, began to pull from collegiate and professional sport, was one of the biggest mistakes it possibly could have made, because of a limited knowledge and asking the wrong question, just as you said. And I have a firsthand direct experience with this, with one of the Tier 1 units, where I had an individual on part of the medical staff ask me, talk to us about what sort of elite athletes you feel these guys most resemble, and how you think that should influence how they're prepared. And to your point, this was a few years ago, to your point, I said to this individual, you're asking me the wrong question. It's a mistake to think of any of these guys as athletes. And further, it's a mistake to compare them to other competitive athletes. What must be understood, which is what I just described the last few minutes, on the fundamental level, is what do they actually do? What is the structure of what they do? Their decision making, the communication. Yes, there are certain physical motions and actions that they have to have durability for, in terms of the ground reaction forces of impacts from fast ropes, parachute openings, the structures of the shoulder and the scapula, operating the risers under high altitude, high opening canopy rides, etc. Yes, there are a handful, the VBSS for those units that operate in boats, and the traumatic impact stresses associated with rough sea states. There's really a handful. There's no more than a handful of unique things that do distinguish physically the rigors you're faced with in training, particularly in certain special operations unit. But it's a very small amount. And the pertinent question is, what is it? How do we characterize what these men do in very specific language? How do we characterize that? Now, how do we prepare for that? And this is me on the outside talking about someone who worked at one of these commands, basically bringing them up to speed on how to more effectively do their job. And these things, despite how controversial they might be, because, for instance, what I'm saying, what I write about in the book is, on the one hand, it's so very different from what the near, not all, but from what the near totality of everybody is doing, yet when I explain it, it's unarguable. And now, why is that? It's because what I'm explaining is not some peripheral light in the loafers guesswork. I'm basing my criticisms off of a knowledge of what's fundamentally irrefutable, which is to say the first principles nature of the problem. and how ironically, whether it's sport preparation or military selection, or we could go down the list of the specific derivatives, ironically, how much of a departure there is between what's irrefutably and objectively true first principles about the nature of what constitutes, let's say, excellence as a tight head prop in rugby, or as a quarterback in American football, or as a such and such operator in a given special operations context. The disparity between the fundamental nature that non-negotiably characterizes the structure, both psychological, sensory, motor, physical, and on, of their job. The disparity between that structure, which no one can refute, and the structure of what they're actually doing to prepare. And therein lies the nature of my consulting.
Yeah, and my point was, if you had to be an elite athlete to qualify for one of these special operations units, then I would not have qualified. So now if we're talking about truly elite athletes, a lot of times I think it's a fascinating question. When you have someone at the highest level of sport, say, for example, you were critical of some of the mechanical phenomenon displayed by the record holder from the NFL Combine, and a lot of times physical preparation people will look at someone like that and say, well, he has the record for the Combine, like we can't touch him because the fear is that they're going to make that person worse. Even if you're looking at working with someone like even Usain Bolt, I suppose if you're very critical and you have the right technology, you could find what could be construed as mechanical flaws in his acceleration and his stride at top speed. And again, a lot of people will say, well, I don't want to touch that guy. We're just going to effectively just keep training him and maybe manipulate his volume and intensity, but not touch the mechanics. Now, I think you're somebody who would go on the other side and say, we need to continually try to alter the mechanics and reach for some sort of an optimal. Now, speaking in the abstract, because people will say, oh, well, it's not just about mechanics. Perhaps what we see as flawed mechanics could optimize, motor unit recruitment or synchronization, or even some hormonal factors that might contribute to performance. But let's say we're speaking in the abstract, purely about mechanics and isolation of other phenomenon that we can't measure. Why or when is it appropriate to intervene with a very high-level athlete who might have what could be construed as flawed mechanics or flawed technique?
It's amazing, Doug, to conceptualize the magnitude of bad thinking in sport, that if I enjoy using analogies because they both provide a perspective, and for me, it's a way for me to amuse myself. And so let me answer your question this way. You mentioned John Ross, and I just made a video where I criticized the really substantial degree of mechanical dysfunction associated with his sprint mechanics that were only compensated for by his clear, extraordinary biomotor abilities. Imagine, let me give you an analogy. Let's talk about a Formula One race car. And the lug nuts that hold the wheels on are loose. Let's just say the right front tire. Now, anyone notices as the thing is speeding down the track, the way that the right front tire is gyrating, not moving in a uniform circular rotation. Now, let's just simply, I'm not being dramatic, I'm not embellishing. Let's just create more of the analog of what you just well described in sport, which is to say there's many coaches who won't touch mechanics. Now, the reason they won't is because they don't have the knowledge, but there's many coaches who won't, in favor of, well, let's just not get the guy hurt. Let's just load him in this way and not interfere with that. Imagine if the same held true in the Formula One car. Imagine if the crew chief and everybody else said, okay, yeah, I see the wheel wobbling, but you know what? Let's just see what more we can get out of the engine. Forget about the wheel. the wheel's the wheel. What are we going to do? Let's just see if we can get more horsepower of this baby. I mean, that's unconscionable. That would never happen. It's unconscionable. Similarly, you mentioned that you had an individual on with an expertise in aviation. Imagine in aeronautical engineering. Imagine in a pre-flight check if these engineers notice some structural integrity issue with one of the wings. It's unconscionable to think that, whatever, it'll make it. Let's not screw with it. Let's just fill the thing up so it can, make the transoceanic journey. That's unconscionable. It just does not compute. Yet, and you described it well, Doug, and I've certainly seen it in anybody else, that's actually common practice in sport. Common practice, which is to say, a mechanical dysfunction, irrefutable, that unquestionably increases structural overload to both that local site and associated with whatever kinetic chain it's involved in. Unquestionably, just the question is how much. That's something that's difficult to put a summary on without further investigatory practice. But there's no question that the price goes. So, for example, if anyone looks at the video that I made, which is on my site of John Ross, no one can refute what I'm pointing out objectively because I'm utilizing kinematic positional dimensional analysis. So no one can refute clearly there's a structural price increase, clearly cannot argue that. So given that, how do we answer the question of, well, why is it then that we could have so many people, whether it's this video of this guy sprinting or any other athlete in any other sport, the fact that there could be someone on that staff that says, we got a big problem. The way this woman or where this man is moving, I've found a substantial asymmetry, and I'm certain that it's yielding structural overload. How much, I'm not sure. We need to do something about this. How do we answer the question that without argument, in many cases, the authority figure, and here we can get into the problems of the vertical authority. The problem with that autonomous decision-making figure in complete autonomy is saying, let's just do what we can around it. Just see what they can do. Let's work around it. We don't have time for this. We don't have time. Let's just do what you can do. We'll see how they do. I mean, it's unthinkable in almost any other industry. Even something less innocuous, because I'm talking about the race car or the airplane where ultimately someone could die. What if it's something more innocuous in terms of food preparation? Which is to say that the worst possible outcome is just, oh man, this thing is overcooked. This is way too salt. No one's going to die, let's say, for sake of example. But even then it's unconscionable. In what condition does that person running the kitchen, I don't care whether it's a fast food restaurant or a 3 Michelin star utopian, environment for someone who lives to eat as I do. It doesn't matter. It's unconscionable to think, let's go to a fast food. Imagine if some line cook in the fast food restaurant notices that there is a finger embedded in the meat. To use an extreme example, it's unconscionable that that's seen and then passed forward through the line to continue by either them or some manager that says, there's nothing we can do. Just dress it up. Put a lot of mayo on that thing. That's unconscionable. And what if we even go more subtle? Oh, I dropped this thing on the floor. I stepped on it by accident. Now we get into the realm of, I bet you that has happened. I bet it's happened. They dropped it on the floor. They thought, it's the 5-second rule. I can pick it up and put it on the thing. It's probably happened. But we're not questioning whether it's happened or not. We're questioning what really is the moral, ethical boundaries that one sets forth. So despite the fact that it's more innocuous that, the burger got dropped on the floor before and it ended up going back, despite the fact that that's more, because clearly there could be some bacteria or pathogen on the floor, but let's just say there isn't, just the fact that it dropped on the floor and it's unclean, that's more innocuous, because we're not talking about the health of this athlete that's being placed on the line because they're encountering, particularly as the biomotor outputs rise, regardless of whether it's the sprint or something that happens with an upper body appendage during some collision with an opponent or what have you, that price just goes up and up and up as the outputs rise. And it's an unavoidable truth. It's the reason why if the 2-year-old jumps off the bleachers that are 3 times his height, he lands and goes rolling away, running, laughing, but the 300-pound lineman pays a different price. Why? Well, the laws of physics explain why. And the ground reaction force is associated with the greater mass that's accelerating in such a way that the impact force is phenomenally greater than the 2-year-old who weighs 15 kilograms. So in the same way, the implications are in fact the greatest the higher you go in sport, because usually, not always, but usually the higher you go in sport, the biomotor output potential of those athletes goes up. They're able to generate more force than their younger counterparts, more velocity, more angular momentum, etc. And therefore, the cost of mechanical efficiency is greater and greater, which makes it that much more unconscionable that so much of it is overlooked, as you described, as I've seen, as anybody else has seen, ultimately swinging back to the moral ethical violation of this athlete that's been placed at risk.
Yeah, what's crazy is you would think that physiotherapy would be the field that is enforcing some of these mechanical standards, and some people in my field in particular have taken kind of, they don't want to speak in absolutes to such an extent that they'll say, well, it doesn't really matter how you move because there's no research to show that, for example, an occupational, somebody working in a factory lifting a box off the floor with a rounded lumbar spine has more potential for pain than somebody lifting it with a more natural lordosis. And they'll say that really, they shouldn't teach a quote-unquote right or wrong way to do things, but just gradually build people's tolerance up for whatever motor pattern it is they choose to do innately or inherently. And I think, again, yes, like you don't want to speak in absolutes, but you don't want to be so relativistic to the point that you don't have any standards at all. And this is actually like a huge issue in physiotherapy. So if it's happening there, it's not surprising that it's happening in sport coaching.
And further, we acknowledge the truth in that statement. And what I would go on to say, whereas you said you would conjecture that physiotherapy should sort of lead that charge of mechanical correctness. What I would actually I would refute that specific claim in favor of this idea of a generalized governing dynamics of education that then allows for natural tendencies to specialize. In this way, the decision maker. Now, I'm still an advocate of a flat hierarchy, but even in that case, someone is in charge. And I point towards Elon Musk as maybe one of the best examples, because he still characterizes himself as an engineer first, even though he's a successful CEO of these paradigm-shifting industries in SpaceX and Tesla and SolarCity, et cetera. So this is what it looks like to have someone who's in charge of everyone, who also has a deep, deep understanding of one of the aspects of operating tradecraft. So similarly, if we extrapolate that to sport, we see that there could be no more, in conversation, there's no more logistically ideal situation than if that person in charge has the applied knowledge sufficient enough to both recognize and understand that something needs to be fixed, and then someone else on staff who's tended towards specifically that type of problem solving more comprehensively is in a position to guide that process. But everybody's actually operating under the same title because they have the same fundamental understanding of all requisite components. So even in pardon me, even in my model, what I'm saying is there's no more physiotherapist, because physiotherapy is irrefutably part of the governing dynamics necessary to be competent as a sport coach, in my judgment. And therefore, every individual who has a governing dynamics education, some functional equivalent, modernized relative to the trivium and quadrivium, now easily diverges into one of the more specialized subcomponents, but not as an administrative recognition, going back to physicist Neil Turok and the perimeter in Ames, but rather, sure, we benefit from having someone with more knowledge in that domain, but not at the expense of not having peripheral knowledge. So we're not looking to fill this with we're not willing to comprise this organization solely based upon a group of specialists, but rather individuals who have been more similarly educated on the generalized relevant subject matter areas, who then and only then went on to have a more comprehensive understanding of specialized knowledge. So there's a very big distinction to be made there.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, I hope that we can get to that point. You and I could go on forever. For people who want to learn more about you, and I know that you've recently redone your website, you have some unique online mentorship and consulting opportunities. Can you just tell the audience a little bit about where they can find you?
My website is globalsportconcepts.net, and everything is available there.
Okay, great. Well, James, I know how busy you are, and you get these kind of requests all the time. So again, I appreciate how generous you've been with your time, and look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thank you very much, Doug. This has been an excellent conversation.
All right. Thanks again.